young men and women are turning in ever greater numbers to a very casual pornography, especially with regards to the boys, to the abandonment of any relationships whatsoever. And then, interestingly enough, it seems, to much less sexual activity in general. What's happening paradoxically is that by removing all the principles from sexual interaction, not the inhibitions, but the principles, we're actually dooming the sexual enterprise rather than facilitating it, even for the hedonists.
I think what's happening generally is people are having probably more casual sex, but they're having sex less frequently. So when they are having sex, it's more likely to be casual, but they're not forming these long-standing relationships. On the one hand, we have this astounding availability of sexual stimuli at the click of a button at any moment. Anything that you can imagine is available on the internet immediately. And that seems to be demotivating people to actually seek out meaningful sexual relationships, which in the long term are vastly better for us in every possible way. But we have a culture enabled by technology which is very, very short term in every way. So people are channeled towards that kind of immediate relief.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy today to be able to talk to Louise Perry. We'll have an interesting conversation about sexual dynamics and the relative role of women and men. Louise Perry, my guest today, is a UK-based journalist, author, and columnist, writing on the topics of sexual freedom and the current state of feminism and the feminine. Her recent book is The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, published in 2022, so a new book. It notes the emergence of a widespread disillusionment with sex, particularly among the young, male and female alike, and discusses the long-term psychological and social error of a life of hedonistic urges in the midst of the upheaval of traditional marital concepts. Louise is also the director of The Other Half, a new nonpartisan feminist think tank, and the host of Maiden, Mother, Matriarch, a developmental progression, a podcast about sexual politics. Hello, Louise. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to me today. You wrote a rather controversial book recently. Let's talk about the book. I'm just going to walk through the chapters and give everybody a preview of where we're heading. So, Chapter 1, Sex Must Be Taken Seriously. So that doesn't sound like much fun. Number 2, men and women are different. Well, that'll get you in trouble, that's for sure too. So, some desires are bad. Loveless sex is not empowering. Consent is not enough. And people are not products. Well, if you were trying to pick a fight in today's society, particularly with those on the left, I would say, you couldn't have picked 6 more contentious titles for chapters, with the possible exception of people are not products. I suppose most people on the left, even the radicals, would agree with that statement, but the rest of it pretty much runs counter to, I would say, the juvenile delusions of our present culture. I was interested today, I was going through your book again, and I noticed once again that you started with the story of Marilyn Monroe and Hugh Hefner. And I was just talking to my wife about that the other day. I think it was probably in a conversation motivated by the fact that this podcast was coming up, and we talked about the emergence of pornography during our lifetime, and when both of us are around 60, and when we were young, the standard pornographic recourse, you might say, was Playboy. But that soon multiplied like a hydra, and first of all, there was Playboy, and it had some pretensions to something like culture, and there was a certain style associated with it, and a certain, what would you call it, veneer of sophistication. It was all jazz and penthouses and and New York and freedom and youth and, sexual activity between consenting adults, all free of other entanglements, but completely conscious of what they were doing. And there were highbrow interviews and, sort of in jokes. And so Playboy was quite effective at generating a kind of late Rat Pack cool around itself. But then the next iteration of the pornographic ascent was Penthouse, and it was the harder core version of Playboy. It got a lot more gynecological, let's say. And then Hustler hit after that, and everybody knew at that point, no matter what their attitude was toward Playboy, that we'd stepped into a new sort of swamp of monstrosity. And then, of course, it wasn't long after that, 15 years maybe, something like that, that porn hit the internet, and then away we went. So let's start talking about Marilyn Monroe and her. I mean, she embodied this feminine archetype of the sex kitten, I guess, the femme fatale too, but she's more on the sex kitten end of things, and she's still an icon. And she's an icon that even gave rise to figures such as Madonna, I would say, because Madonna played with the Marilyn Monroe image a lot and with a fair bit of success, but it's not like Marilyn exactly had a good time with it. So she died very young, by her own hand. Why don't you tell a little bit more of her story?
Yeah, she had a fairly miserable life from start to finish. One of the reasons I decided to open the book by talking about Marilyn Monroe and Hugh Hefner is partly because just through good luck from my perspective as a writer, they were born in exactly the same year, even though, of course, Monroe died young and Hefner lived well into his 90s. And they were both these incredible icons of the sexual revolution. Marilyn for her beauty and Hefner for his success with Playboy magazine. But they lived extraordinarily different lives, and they experienced sexual liberation, so-called, in completely different ways. Marilyn Monroe grew up in foster homes, was a victim of child sexual abuse and of domestic violence as an adult, and, as you say, died by her own hand, long-standing substance abuse issues, etc. Hefner didn't suffer in that way. I mean, I do think that actually by the time Hefner grew old, he had lost the glamour that he had as a younger man. I think that he is evidence of the fact that even the most successful Playboy has a shelf life, not as short a shelf life as the sexually liberated woman does. I mean, really, in reality, with a modern Western lifespan, you're talking maybe a quarter of that. You might be really sexually desirable, which is why I think it's risky to place all of your self-esteem on that value, or indeed to base your career, base your life around being sexually desirable, because it's really not very long.
Well, that's a good place to take a slight detour. A lot of your book makes a moral case, and moral cases aren't particularly popular now, but there are some interesting ways of discussing morality technically that I think might be worth delving into. So one of the things that people who are watching and listening might be interested in knowing is that people pursue different mating strategies, so to speak. That's how evolutionary psychologists or biologists describe it. And you can make the same case in the animal kingdom to some degree. And there are short-term mating strategies, and that would be associated with an ethos of the glorification, let's say, or the practice of casual sex, so sex without relationship. And one of the questions that you might ask is, are there pronounced differences between people who tend to pursue short-term mating strategies versus long-term mating strategies? Now, a long-term mating strategy would be accompanied by the formulation of a relationship of mutual support. That's what makes it sustainable. And the answer is, well, yeah, there are marked differences. one of the hallmarks of antisocial personality, and so that's the personality characteristic set that is associated with criminality, is a proclivity towards short-term mating strategies. And that is associated with early onset of sexual activity and multiple sexual partners, and then in its more pathological form, a predatory or parasitical lifestyle in relationship to sex. And so that has been elaborated more recently into the analysis of so-called dark tetrad personality characteristics. That's an emerging model of the malevolent and pathological personality, and that involves Machiavellianism, which is manipulative, narcissistic, which is virtue-free attention-seeking. It's a good way of thinking about it. Psychopathy, which is predatory parasitism, and sadism, which is positive delight in harm to other people. And all of those delightful characteristics are associated with a striking proclivity for short-term mating, and that brings up the stark realization that it's a form of exploitation. That's a good way of thinking about it. And it's fundamentally the exploitation of women, because here's a good way of defining women. Since we don't know how to do that in our society anymore, we might as well start with basics. And throughout the animal kingdom, and this is true all the way from sperm and egg up to fully embodied being, the female is almost inevitably the sex that pours more resources into reproduction. So that means that women bear a higher cost for sexual reproduction. In case anyone's still too stupid to actually understand that, might as well make it explicit. And what that also means is that if there's exploitation going on in a sexual relationship, it's most often, although not always, the male who has less at stake exploiting the female who has far more at stake. And it's enticing for young women to believe, I suppose, if they want to pursue hedonic pleasure, that they can escape from that reality, but it's very difficult to. So that's one element. Then the next element with regard to morality is, if you're playing a game that only works in the short term for others, but also for yourself, then that's not a very good game. And, the point you were making was that Marilyn was playing a particularly short game. And even Hugh, who had less to lose, and arguably, on some dimensions, more to gain, he was still pretty damn pathetic by the time he hit, I would say, mid-50s. I watched one of his late TV shows where he was touring Europe with his 3 blonde bimbos who were not they weren't the sharpest knives in the drawer, let's put it that way. And it was Hugh and his 3 blonde clones traipsing painfully from faux glamorous restaurant to faux glamorous restaurant through Europe, engaging in conversations so puerile and painful that anyone with any sense would have run away from the table screaming after 5 minutes. So he turned into his own parody, and that was quite clear. I mean, anybody with any sense at all, no matter how much they might have been enamored by his young and hypothetically glamorous self, if you had looked at that with a cold eye a few decades later, it was looking pretty oldest boy at the frat party. It had that whole stench about it, I would say. So, all right, so back to Marilyn. You said that she had a pretty brutal upbringing and was exploited pretty early on. You might as well tell the story about her, the famous photographs that launched Playboy.
So Marilyn was both the first cover star and also the first naked centerfold in the first issue of Playboy. But the naked photos were acquired without her consent. She'd had them taken many years before when she was much younger for very little money just because she was desperate. She'd signed the release with a false name, but somehow Hefner got hold of them and paid the photographer rather than her in order to publish them in Playboy. And she wasn't even sent a free copy and was apparently very upset about it. Hefner ended up buying the crypt next to hers at the the cemetery in Los Angeles where they're both buried, obviously buried many decades after she was, but they never actually met in real life. So this whole kind of relationship between the two of them was very much initiated by him. And I mean, this is the point, though, I want to make with talk about Marilyn Monroe. She is very typical of female sex icons in having this kind of tragic backstory, multiple forms of exploitation by lots of people, most of them men, and yet she is held up as this this iconic figure of the sexual revolution, which we're supposed to believe was a good thing, right? And my argument in the book, it is of course the case against the sexual revolution. My argument is not that it was entirely bad. I don't think you can paint any huge historical event as entirely bad or entirely good, but I think that it has been falsely presented mostly by progressives through rose-tinted spectacles, and this is my attempt to counter that.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt she was an iconic figure and still is, and part of the reason, it's hard to say exactly why. I mean, there's something obviously hyper-attractive about her, and I heard her interviewed once in a radio station where she said she could walk down the street. I believe her genuine name was Norma Ray. Is that right? Norma Ray? And she said she could walk down the street as Norma Ray and no one would look at her. Or she could walk down the street as Marilyn and then people would just be attracted to her like mad. And so I want to run a hypothesis by you, given that that backstory for female sexual icons, and this is often the case for girls who get dragged or who agree to participate in the pornography industry, that they're often abandoned girls who have a history of fractured relationships and abuse. Now, so here's a hypothesis, that girls without fathers hit puberty 1 year earlier, eh? That's a real biological mystery, but here's a hypothesis. So imagine that you're bereft of male companionship and productivity and protection. And maybe that's because your culture doesn't have enough men. Sometimes that happens after wars, for example, or maybe you're just in an economic niche or a social niche where you're unfortunate, So now, why would you develop a year early from a puberty perspective? Well, the answer is, one of the ways that women can attract male attention, obviously, and therefore, in principle, companionship, protection, productivity, all of that might come along with a real relationship, is by being sexually attractive and available. And so if there's a dearth of males in the local environment, then early puberty could easily be a way of increasing the probability of catching a mate early enough so you don't starve to death, let's say. Okay, so then imagine that there's a psychological equivalent to that. And this is where that waif-like femme fatale archetype might kick in. And so if you're appealingly, vulnerably beautiful and available, and then you have that magic that can go along with that when it's transformed into something truly archetypal, which Marilyn did extraordinarily well. There was a bit of a little girl about her. She had a very girly voice, and that's how she sang. And she had a kind of innocent, naive provocativeness that was amplified, paradoxically, by her overt sexuality. And so she had some of the appeal of a helpless child and some of the appeal of a truly mature woman. And that can be a very deadly combination. And I think the fact that it's a deadly combination is also a kind of adaptation. So you can imagine that girls who are abused might turn to that pattern of seductive behavior, because if they turn on the charm full throttle in that manner, it increases the probability that even in their desperate economic straits, they might be able to attract a male. And of course, with Marilyn, that was elevated right to the point where she became literally the poster girl for that approach. And then I mentioned Madonna a little earlier, and when Madonna first came on the scene, I thought, she's kind of interesting. She seems to be taking this Marilyn-like archetype, but toying with it consciously. She was a businesswoman, pretty canny. She seemed to be in charge of her own image. And I thought maybe she had a grip on the archetype, but it isn't obvious to me at all that she did. Madonna's life has been characterized by a continual pattern of sexual attention seeking. And she's also, I would say, turned into her own parody, even in her, I think she's in her late 60s now, if I remember correctly. She's still doing photo shoots that are leveraging pornographic attractiveness. And that requires a lot of maintenance and makeup by the time you're at her stage of life. But it doesn't really look to me like it's aged particularly well. And that's the problem with short-term mating strategy, is that it's not a good iterating game. You can't play it with other people continually. You have to have multiple partners. And it's not a good pattern for your whole life course. That's partly what makes it both immoral and unwise, is It just doesn't work across the decades that you're going to be alive. So,
yes.
All right, so back to Marilyn and Hugh. So
on that point, I decided to call my podcast Maiden, Mother, Matriarch, because it's my hypothesis that one of the features of late 20th, early 21st century culture is that the normal life progression that women are supposed to pass through from maiden to mother to matriarch has been interrupted. And we now have a very widespread problem of women desperate to remain in maiden mode permanently. And Madonna is a beautiful example of that. She can't find it within herself to accept progressing from maiden to matriarch. And I think that's the key cause of that is the fact that we don't attach status to maidens and to mothers and to matriarchs in the way that we once did. I think that all of the status is loaded onto the maiden role. But it's necessarily, as you say, a role that you can't spend your entire life in. And I think that explains a lot of the psychological dysfunction that women suffer from.
Yeah. Well, I think that's right. So what we have is the domination. You basically laid out a 3-part archetype, and it's an archetype of transformation. And I've talked to some pretty bright women on my podcast, and a number of them have commented that as they progress along their careers and as they accrue productive status, so let's say as mothers and matriarchs, they don't necessarily attain a commensurate status, particularly among young women, interestingly enough. And maybe that's because the women are competing. I suppose a woman can be attractive as a mother and a matriarch, and so the maidens might take exception to that because it's a form of competition. But I do think, too, that our culture hyper-values the maiden image, especially when that's allied with, it's not virginal maiden that's exactly held up as an icon. Even though people like Madonna will play with the idea of virginity as something attractive, it's only there as a sexual magnet, and it's only there tongue-in-cheek in some real sense. And then our culture, because it's a consumer culture, and also because, it concentrates on teenagers a lot because they have disposable income. And it's really the case that our culture became consumerist-oriented when teenagers started to develop disposable income. It's not surprising at all that the consumer market tilts towards the maiden archetype because that's where there's spare money to be vacuumed up. So that's sort of a perfect storm in some sense. And so, so our developing hypothesis here in the podcast, and obviously you've thought this through to a great degree, is that part of the reason that the sexual revolution claiming absolute sexual freedom is pathological is because, it enables the male exploiters, and that's not good at all, but it also isn't a good medium to long-term game. Well, I would say either for women or men. I mean, if you develop a long-term partner in a woman and you're a man, you might want a woman who has enough sense to move from maiden to mother to matriarch, and to do that in a manner that facilitates the development of the relationship across time. And maybe, I wonder too, if a woman who does that really well is, as she progresses across that 3-part track, also to some degree integrates the previous stages as she moves forward. Because it might be the case that if you're a successful matriarch, maybe that's at the point where you become a grandmother, something like that, that you've also integrated mother and even maiden and are still capable of playing those roles when that's appropriate, but are no longer only limited to them. And I'm not saying that's an easy thing to pull off because, it's not that hard to be, it's not that easy to be, outstandingly sexually attractive, male or female, by the time you're in your 60s, let's say. It gets to be, old age is fighting against that pretty hard, but that doesn't mean that that can't be held forward as, an unattainable ideal to which we all might strive, or at least hope might make itself manifest. And I think that's actually a possibility, that you can move towards something like a full integration.
Like Russian dolls, I think, is the perfect image for it. The Russian dolls that contain the younger, the smaller counterparts in the whole. That's the aspiration. I mean, I think part of the reason that we're so focused on the maiden role is partly, as you say, because it's a very consumerist kind of product. This strange paradox where on the one hand, I'd say Western society is increasingly gerontocratic in that power and assets primarily are disproportionately held by the old, but it's also still a very, very youth-orientated culture in terms of politics, in terms of fashion, beauty, all of this kind of stuff. You have that kind of strange tension where young people are simultaneously incredibly culturally powerful, but not actually very economically powerful, which probably actually exacerbates the feelings of tension there. I think another reason for it as well is I think that women's lives tend to be more clearly segmented by reproductive stage in a way that maybe men's are less so. I think that men's lives change a bit less when they become fathers, when they become grandfathers. And I think that part of the resistance to this natural progression among women comes from the fact that so much of feminism of the second wave has been about trying to be more masculine in every way, in a way that I think is ultimately detrimental to women. That's why I called Chapter 2 Men and Women Are Different, because I think we have to just start from the premise that men and women are fundamentally different. There is a sexual asymmetry that is never going away. There are average psychological, but nevertheless at the population level they matter. There are these differences between men and women. And actually I think that any kind of productive form of feminism has to start from that recognition that those fundamental differences aren't going anywhere.
Yeah. Okay. So let's focus on that now. So now we're off to Chapter 2. I'm going to make a counter case for a minute, and then let's hash that out. All right. So we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast that the fundamental biological differentiator, or one of them, because there's a number, is that what makes a creature female rather than male is disproportionate contribution to reproduction. And so you even see that with the sperm and the egg. The egg is way, way bigger across the biological universe than the sperm. And that means the egg has more resources than the sperm. And that is echoed at every stage of sexual interaction in animals and human beings. There's a few exceptions in some regards, like I think male seahorses care for the young, for example. They basically have something approximating a pregnancy, but that's enough of an exception so that most people who are biologically informed know about it. It's extraordinarily rare for the male to take on that role, and so women are the half of the human race that bears disproportionate responsibility for sexual reproduction, pays a higher cost for it. And that seems to shape everything, including mating strategies. But here's the killer. And so we could also say that's been true for the entire course of reproductive history after the emergence of sex, which emerged a very long time ago, biologically speaking. But the pill hit, 50 years ago and was made widespread very rapidly. And what that did in principle, and to some degree in reality, was give females voluntary control of their reproductive function, really for the first time in biological history. And so that opened up a new question. And this is a question. If a woman has full voluntary control over her reproductive function, why isn't she now just a man? That's one question. Or what exactly distinguishes her from a man? Because one thing that distinguished her was her differential role in reproductive burden, and now that's been ameliorated, arguably, to some degree. And then also, if reproductive function is now a matter of voluntary choice, why can't sex just be fun and free? And I would say we've been wrestling with those two questions for 50 years and longer than that, insofar as there's been some form of reliable contraception, but it wasn't very damn reliable till the birth control pill kicked in. And so I think it is an open question, to what degree can sex just be, fun and fancy free? And also it's an open question, to what degree aren't women just now the same as men? And so, any comments on that whole line of inquiry are more than welcome.
Well, that's the promise, right, of the sexual revolution, that by introducing this new technology shock, we do erase the differences between the sexes. And I think that to some extent, if you live a very modern life, it's not just the pill, obviously, that's changed in the last 60 years. We also have very different ways of working. People are much less likely to do manual work, at least in the West, than they used to be. We live much more mixed lives. There's much less homosexuality than there used to be. And so people are interacting in the workplace or whatever in basically an egalitarian fashion between men and women. If you live that kind of life where you're not really using your sexed body for anything, you're just, living the life of the mind, really, you could believe that those differences are trivial. And I think that's where we've had some very strange political ideas around, for instance, having biological males competing in women's sports, is seen to be a completely logical thing from people who do essentially live those lives, who probably haven't actually competed in sports. I mean, you'll notice that female athletes tend to be opposed to this because they tend to be completely aware of the fact that there are huge differences in performance between male and female athletes. But for people...
But you can usually mob them into silence, though.
Yeah, some of them are brave enough to say so, many of them, yeah, as you say. But many people who don't really do sports, who don't live very physical lives, may be genuinely quite oblivious to this fact, because that seems to be the promise of technology, that it erases these differences. I don't think that it does. I mean, not only because we don't yet have artificial wombs, we still reproduce the old-fashioned way, and I think are likely to for the foreseeable. I don't think artificial wombs are just around the corner. I think actually they're a spectacularly difficult technology to develop. And also because we still have the same brains, essentially, that our Stone Age ancestors did. We spent 95% of our species history as hunter-gatherers. It is humanity's first and most successful adaptation. And I think that we can't, no matter how intelligent we are, no matter how desperately we try, I think it's very, very hard to erase those differences at the psychological level. And the response, interestingly, that I've had to this book since it was published is obviously a hugely controversial title. The whole premise is hugely controversial. But interestingly, I haven't had nearly as much criticism as I thought I would. And I've actually had positive reviews, even from left-leaning outlets and so on. I got an amazing review in The Observer, I think it's because actually an enormous number of women across the political spectrum who have been offered this promise of you can live just like a man, you can have sex just like a man, they're profoundly miserable. And they do recognise that actually deep down, that promise is an empty one. And I think there's the emotion that I've had most often from readers is just a sense of relief that someone is saying it, and that it seems as if there's now permission to say it. Because I think that the effort of trying to pretend that men and women are the same is ultimately ruinous to both sexes.
Yeah, well, you see this weird phenomenon emerging on the left in particular, and I think it's particularly rife in university campuses, where you get a combination of compassion and low conscientiousness and high openness driving a particular political mindset. And so the compassion means, well, we're going to accept everyone. And the low conscientiousness means, well, we're not bound by anything approximating duty. And the high openness means, we're creative and curious about every form of potential self-expression. And then that produces this idea that all sexual drive, you have a chapter in your book called something like Not All Desire is Good. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. There's this absolute clamoring insistence that every form of sexual desire and behavior is to be valued, celebrated, and promoted, and that if you dare oppose that, there's something immoral about the opposition. So that's merely a consequence, let's say, of your bigotry. And you pointed out in your book that you often get artistic types like André Gide, let's say, and left-wing intellectuals pushing for full sexual freedom. And some of that's high openness and some of that's low conscientiousness, that's for sure. But then there's a kickback that's really interesting to me, because it's the same radicals possessed by exactly the same set of ideas who make a very radical counterclaim. And the counterclaim is something like, well, every form of sexual behavior must be celebrated and is nothing but a testament to the ever-blossoming range of human freedom. But every form of sexual interaction between particularly a young man and a young woman is so dangerous right to its core that there's nothing more important than full consent. And that consent has to be documented verbally and maybe even beyond verbally, formally, for even interactions that were once as casual, let's say, as dancing. And so at Princeton University, for example, there was a push to make men ensure that even when they're dancing with a girl who agreed to dance, that it was incumbent upon them multiple times during the dance to ask verbally to ensure that once established consent was still continuing. Now, if you weren't being cynical about that, you might say, well, that's a stumbling attempt to something approximating awake politeness, because if you have any sense, when you're dancing with someone, one of the things you actually want to know is, do they really want to be doing it? But it's very peculiar to me and illuminating that this insistence on negotiated contract for every step of a potentially sexual interaction is being insisted upon not by Christian apologists for traditional morality, but by the same radicals who are out there dancing three-quarters naked in the street in their dog costumes and insisting that, every bit of sexual expression is to be lauded.
My suspicion with what's going on there, with this rise of sort of a bureaucratic attitude to sex, shall we say, this idea of asking for consent at every stage and so on. I mean, the funniest example, which I mentioned briefly in the book, is an idea cooked up by some university students that you would sign a contract before you had casual sex, and you'd take a photo of the pair of you with your contract and so on. And the joke obviously is, why not get dressed up in a big white dress? Why not invite all your friends? It's this sort of reinvention of marriage. I think that's basically what is going on.
We're married for the day. That's the contract.
I think what's going on with this reintroduction of these new rules post-Me Too is that complete sexual freedom is not actually a sustainable system. And what we've had for many centuries, millennia, up until the 1960s really, is a very complicated tapestry of laws and norms which regulate sexuality and which particularly regulate heterosexuality. Because what you're dealing with when it comes to heterosexuality is great imbalances of physical strength, the fundamental imbalance of reproductive roles, and also personality differences and all of this, which make it it's just inherently very, very difficult to deal with mating smoothly. There is a lot of heartache, there is a lot of risk. And what we have in most societies is this complex dance of marriage customs and, thinking more recently in the West, chaperones and asking of the father's hand and all of these things which are supposed to basically control sexuality. I mean, the progressive account of this is that they repress people's sexuality, to which I say, yes, they do. But they do that because they have to, because that is it. Completely untrammeled sexual freedom is not possible because of, you can't run a society like that, and because you will inevitably have people coming into conflict with one another if that's permitted. So you need people to be, men and women, to be repressed. I think that's what marriage does.